The difference between experience and expertise is what happens when everything stops working. The Bugatti Chiron sat motionless beneath the bright lights of the Technology Expo like a sculpture worth millions of dollars. Hundreds of guests filled the convention center parking plaza outside downtown Chicago. Investors, executives, reporters, and industry leaders had gathered for what was supposed to be a celebration of innovation. Instead, nearly every conversation now revolved around a single problem. The car would not start. Victoria Sterling stood beside the Bugatti with her arms folded tightly across her chest. As the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country, she was accustomed to solving problems quickly. This problem refused to cooperate. 20 engineers surrounded the vehicle. Laptops rested on portable tables. Diagnostic equipment connected to various access points. Expensive tools lay scattered across protective mats. For nearly 3 hours they had tested systems, reviewed data, and debated theories. Yet the Bugatti remained silent. "Run the diagnostic sequence again," one engineer said. Another shook his head. "We already did." "Then check the electrical mapping." "We checked that too." Frustration spread through the group. Victoria watched as another attempt ended exactly like the previous 19. Nothing. One of the senior engineers finally stepped back and rubbed his forehead. "This makes no sense." Victoria glanced at her watch. She had another event scheduled in less than 90 minutes. Important investors were waiting. Reporters were already asking questions. The situation was becoming embarrassing. "I do not need explanations," she said firmly. "I need results." No one answered. Across the edge of the crowd, a man stood quietly near a chain-link safety barrier. Most people never noticed him. Jack Carter wore a faded work jacket and a simple blue shirt. Beside him stood his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, holding a science museum gift bag in one hand. They had been walking back toward the parking lot after visiting a nearby engineering exhibit when the crowd caught Sophie's attention. "Dad," she said softly. "Why are so many people looking at that car?" Jack followed her gaze. "Looks like it has a problem." Sophie studied the group of engineers. "Can they fix it?" Jack did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the Bugatti for several seconds. His eyes moved slowly across the vehicle. Then toward the open rear compartment. Then toward the diagnostic equipment. Finally, he looked away. "Maybe," he said. Sophie tilted her head. "That does not sound very confident." A faint smile crossed Jack's face. Confidence and guessing are not the same thing. Nearby, another engineer closed a laptop with visible frustration. Victoria watched the growing confusion among her team. The atmosphere felt heavier with every passing minute. Around her, conversations became quieter. Questions multiplied. Answers disappeared. At the edge of the crowd, Jack remained silent. Yet for reasons even he could not fully explain, something about the situation continued to bother him. And as another failed attempt ended beside the motionless Bugatti, he found himself looking at the car one more time. Jack and Sophie should have left. The museum parking garage was only a few minutes away, and the afternoon traffic would only get worse as the event continued. Yet neither of them moved. Sophie remained near the fence, watching the activity around the disabled car with the same curiosity she brought to every science exhibit. "They still have not fixed it," she said. Jack glanced toward the growing crowd. "No, do you think they will?" Jack studied the scene again. Another engineer was explaining a theory to a group gathered around a laptop. 2 others were reviewing data on a tablet. A fourth was pointing toward the rear of the vehicle. Everyone seemed busy. Everyone seemed confident. Yet the car remained exactly where it had been 3 hours earlier. "Maybe," Jack said. Sophie smiled. "You said that already." Before Jack could respond, a loud sigh came from near the vehicle. Victoria Sterling stepped away from the engineers and walked several feet toward a refreshment station. Her patience was clearly wearing thin. Reporters continued circling the area. Investors stood nearby, pretending not to notice the situation. The longer the problem lasted, the more attention it attracted. One of the senior engineers approached Victoria carrying a diagnostic report. "We have eliminated another possibility." Victoria looked at him. "How many possibilities are left?" The engineer hesitated. "Several." Her expression immediately darkened. "You have had nearly 4 hours. This is a very unusual issue. I am not paying 20 specialists to tell me something is unusual." The engineer lowered his eyes. Meanwhile, Jack quietly watched the exchange. Something about the situation continued to bother him. Not because the vehicle was expensive. Not because of the crowd. Because the engineers seemed focused on symptoms rather than causes. Sophie noticed him staring. "You are doing it again." "Doing what?" "Thinking." Jack laughed softly. "That is usually a good thing. Not when you make that face." He shook his head. "What face?" "The face you make when you already know something but you are still checking." Jack looked at his daughter with amusement. "You notice too much. I learned from you." Nearby, another attempt to start the vehicle failed. Several people groaned quietly. One engineer removed his headset and walked away in frustration. Another suggested running an entirely new diagnostic sequence. Victoria looked exhausted. At that moment, Jack noticed something small. Very small. A detail most people would never pay attention to. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then he looked toward the equipment connected to the car. Then toward one specific panel near the rear compartment. Then back toward the engineers. He said nothing. Sophie followed his gaze. "What are you looking at?" Jack remained silent for a moment. "Probably nothing." Sophie immediately smiled. "That means it is definitely something." Jack could not argue with that. Across the plaza, the senior engineers began debating another theory. Their voices grew louder. More complicated explanations filled the air. More data. More analysis. More assumptions. Yet the tiny detail Jack had noticed remained untouched. Unmentioned. Completely ignored. And as the afternoon sun slowly shifted across the convention center, the man nobody noticed continued watching the one thing nobody else seemed to see. The crowd around the vehicle continued to grow as the afternoon wore on. What had started as a technical problem was slowly becoming a public spectacle. Guests who had originally arrived to discuss innovation were now discussing failure. Reporters stood near the edge of the plaza exchanging theories. Investors checked their watches. Several executives quietly moved their meetings indoors. Yet the center of attention remained exactly the same. The car had not moved an inch. Victoria stood beside a temporary workstation reviewing another diagnostic report when one of the engineers approached with visible confidence. "I think we found it," he said. Several heads immediately turned. Victoria looked up. "You are sure?" "Almost." The engineer began explaining a complex chain of electronic possibilities involving multiple systems communicating through a central control network. Around him, other engineers nodded. The explanation sounded impressive. It sounded technical. It sounded expensive. 10 minutes later they tested the theory. Nothing happened. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. The engineer slowly removed his hands from the controls and stared at the dashboard. No one said a word. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "Next idea," she said. Across the plaza, Sophie watched the scene with growing fascination. That is the third time someone thought they fixed it. Jack nodded. People usually become more confident right before they discover they missed something. Sophie looked toward the vehicle. Did they miss something? Jack folded his arms. Everybody misses something. Even you? A faint smile appeared on his face. Especially me. Sophie seemed surprised by that answer. Then how do you know when you are wrong? Jack glanced toward the crowd. You keep looking until the facts stop arguing with you. Nearby, another team of specialists had begun reviewing sensor data. More screens appeared. More graphs. More discussions. The process became increasingly complicated. Yet the small detail Jack had noticed earlier remained untouched. He watched one engineer walk directly past it. Then another. Then a third. None of them even slowed down. His expression remained calm, but his curiosity continued to grow. Meanwhile, Victoria's frustration was beginning to show. One of her senior advisors approached carefully. We can arrange transportation if necessary. Victoria shook her head. That is not the point. Then what is? She looked toward the vehicle. 20 experts have spent half a day trying to solve one problem. The advisor remained silent. Victoria stared at the car for several seconds. I want to know why. At that moment, a younger engineer carrying a tablet noticed Jack standing near the fence. Their eyes met briefly. The engineer recognized the familiar look. Not confusion. Not excitement. Observation. The young man walked a few steps closer. Enjoying the show? He asked with a faint grin. Jack shrugged. I have seen worse. The engineer laughed. You work on cars? Sometimes. Then maybe you have an idea. Sophie immediately looked up at her father. Jack remained quiet. Just curious, the engineer continued. What do you think? Jack glanced toward the vehicle one more time. Then toward the overlooked area that no one else seemed interested in examining. I think, he said calmly, everyone is looking at the problem they expected to find instead of the one that is actually there. The engineer's smile slowly disappeared. The young engineer looked back toward the vehicle and then toward Jack again. What do you mean by that? He asked. Jack remained calm. Nothing. Just an observation. You think we missed something? The question attracted attention from two nearby engineers. Sophie immediately sensed what was happening. She quietly stepped closer to her father. Jack glanced toward the Bugatti. I think every team eventually reaches a point where they stop investigating and start defending their previous conclusions. One of the engineers overheard the comment and frowned. We have been diagnosing this system for hours. Jack nodded politely. I can see that. The engineer folded his arms. Then you know it is not a simple problem. Most problems are not simple, Jack replied. But their causes usually are. The remark did not land well. A few engineers exchanged looks. One shook his head dismissively before returning to his laptop. Another laughed quietly. The younger engineer seemed uncertain. He was no longer smiling. So what would you check? Jack looked toward the vehicle again. I would start with the thing everyone already decided could not be responsible. Before the engineer could respond, another voice interrupted. And what exactly qualifies you to tell us that? The question came from a senior engineer standing several feet away. His tone was not openly hostile, but it was clearly skeptical. Several people nearby turned to watch. Jack did not appear offended. Nothing, he said. I am just standing here. The senior engineer gave a short laugh. That is what I thought. Sophie looked up at her father. She recognized that expression. It was the same expression he wore whenever someone underestimated him at the repair shop. Calm. Patient. Completely unaffected. Meanwhile, Victoria noticed the growing conversation near the edge of the crowd. She walked over, curious more than concerned. "What is happening?" she asked. The senior engineer gestured toward Jack. "Apparently we have a spectator with opinions." Victoria glanced briefly at Jack. To her, he looked like an ordinary working father spending the afternoon with his daughter. Nothing more. "Do you work on performance vehicles?" she asked. Jack shrugged slightly. "Sometimes." The answer sounded almost absurd given the circumstances. Around them stood specialists with advanced certifications, manufacturer training, and years of engineering experience. Victoria looked back toward the Bugatti. "Then perhaps you understand why this situation is more complicated than it appears." Jack remained silent for a moment. "Actually," he said quietly, "I think it may be less complicated than it appears." A few engineers laughed openly this time. One muttered something under his breath. Another shook his head and returned to his diagnostics. Victoria studied Jack for several seconds. There was something unusual about him. Not confidence. Confidence was common. It was the absence of any need to prove himself. Sophie suddenly tugged lightly on his sleeve. "Dad?" "Yes? Is that the thing you always tell me?" Jack smiled faintly. "Which thing?" Sophie pointed toward the crowded group around the vehicle. "The one about how people stop seeing what is right in front of them when they are looking for something complicated." Several nearby engineers heard every word. And for the first time all afternoon, complete silence settled over that part of the plaza. The silence created by Sophie's question lingered longer than anyone expected. For a few seconds, no engineer spoke. No one returned to a laptop. Even Victoria seemed caught between irritation and curiosity. The senior engineer finally broke the moment with a dismissive laugh. "A child simplifying a multi-million-dollar machine. That is exactly what we needed." Several people chuckled. Sophie looked up at her father. "Did I say something wrong?" Jack shook his head. "No, then why are they laughing?" Jack glanced toward the vehicle. Sometimes people hear a simple question and assume it cannot have a serious answer. Sophie considered that carefully. "That seems strange." "It happens." Victoria watched the exchange. The father never sounded defensive. The daughter never sounded intimidated. It was an unusual combination. Nearby, the younger engineer who had spoken with Jack earlier remained thoughtful. He looked toward the rear of the vehicle, then toward the area Jack had been watching for nearly an hour. Finally, curiosity overcame pride. "What exactly are you looking at?" he asked. Jack remained quiet for a moment. Did anyone verify that every assumption made during the first diagnostic cycle was actually correct? The younger engineer blinked. "Of course." Jack tilted his head slightly. "Verified or assumed?" The question landed differently this time. The young engineer frowned. "There is a difference. A very expensive difference." Several engineers overheard the exchange. One rolled his eyes. Another shook his head. Yet the younger engineer continued thinking. "What assumption?" Jack looked toward the Bugatti again. "The first one." "Which was?" "That the problem started where the failure appeared." The young engineer stared at him. Around them, conversations slowly resumed, but not as confidently as before. Meanwhile, Victoria found herself listening despite having no intention of doing so. She had spent the entire afternoon surrounded by technical explanations. Most involved layers of complexity. Jack's observations felt different. Simpler. More direct. Almost uncomfortable in their simplicity. Sophie tugged lightly on his sleeve. Dad? Yes? Are we leaving soon? Jack smiled. Probably. You always say probably. That is because life enjoys changing plans. Sophie laughed. Nearby, one of the engineers suddenly called out from beside the vehicle. Wait a second. Several heads turned. The young engineer had gone back to review a series of diagnostic logs. His expression had changed completely. He was no longer amused. He was no longer skeptical. He looked confused. What is it? Another engineer asked. The young man pointed toward a screen. This timestamp. Several people gathered around him. Victoria stepped closer as well. The engineer scrolled through the data again. Then again. This does not make sense. The senior engineer frowned. What are you talking about? The younger man pointed toward the display. We all assumed the failure sequence started here. He highlighted a section of data. But it actually started before this. The crowd grew quieter. Jack said nothing. Sophie looked from the engineers to her father and back again. Was that the thing? She whispered. Jack folded his arms. Maybe. Across the plaza, for the first time all day, the engineers were no longer debating new theories. They were questioning an old one. And Victoria could not ignore a growing realization. The only person who seemed unsurprised by that discovery was the man standing quietly beside a chain-link fence with a science museum gift bag hanging from his daughter's hand. The discovery changed the atmosphere immediately. The crowd had spent hours watching experts search for new answers. Now they were watching those same experts question old assumptions. It was a very different process. The younger engineer remained focused on the diagnostic logs. Look at this, he said. Several colleagues gathered around the screen. Victoria stepped closer. The timestamp stretched across multiple system events recorded earlier that day. One sequence appeared normal. Another did not. We ignored this because it happened before the primary failure alert, the engineer explained. Why? Victoria asked. Because we assumed it was unrelated. The answer sounded weaker the moment he said it out loud. Nearby, the senior engineer frowned. That signal could still be secondary. Or it could be the beginning, the younger engineer replied. Across the plaza, Jack listened quietly. Sophie sat on a nearby bench eating a snack from the museum gift shop. Dad? She asked. Yes? Are they getting closer? Jack watched the engineers studying the logs. Closer than they were. Sophie smiled. That means they are learning. Exactly. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower behind the convention center buildings. Long shadows stretched across the pavement. Most people would have gone home by now. Yet nobody seemed willing to leave before the mystery was solved. Victoria glanced toward Jack again. The more she watched him, the stranger the situation felt. He had never claimed to know the answer. He had never tried to attract attention. Yet somehow the direction of the investigation kept moving toward observations he had made from outside the group. Finally, Victoria walked across the plaza. Several people noticed immediately. She stopped a few feet from Jack. Can I ask you something? Jack nodded. Of course. What exactly do you think is wrong? The question attracted instant attention. Conversation stopped. Several engineers looked up from their workstations. Jack glanced toward the vehicle. Then toward Sophie. Then back toward Victoria. I do not know. A few engineers visibly relaxed. But Jack continued. Not yet. Victoria studied him carefully. Then why do you seem so calm? Jack smiled faintly. Because machines do not care about opinions. Victoria waited. They only care about facts. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Victoria looked toward the Bugatti again. If you had 5 minutes with it, where would you start? The question surprised everyone, including some of the engineers. Jack did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the exact area that had held his attention for hours. There. Several heads turned. The location he indicated was not the center of the current investigation. In fact, it was an area many engineers had already dismissed earlier in the day. The senior engineer crossed his arms. We checked that. Jack nodded politely. Maybe. Maybe? There is a difference between checking something and understanding what it is trying to tell you. Silence followed. Even the senior engineer seemed uncertain how to respond. Victoria looked from Jack to the vehicle and back again. Something inside her was changing. Not belief. Not trust. Curiosity. Genuine curiosity. Meanwhile, Sophie finished her snack and stood beside her father. Are we staying longer? She asked. Jack looked at the sky. Then at the crowd. Then at the car. Maybe 5 more minutes. For the first time all afternoon, several engineers exchanged nervous glances. Because somehow those 5 minutes suddenly felt very important. The plaza had become remarkably quiet. Not silent, but different. The kind of quiet that appears when people stop talking and start paying attention. Victoria stood beside the vehicle with her arms folded while engineers exchanged uncertain looks. No one wanted to be the person who invited an outsider into the investigation. At the same time, no one wanted to explain why 20 specialists had failed to solve a problem that still sat directly in front of them. The younger engineer finally broke the tension. Maybe we should let him look. Several heads turned immediately. The senior engineer frowned. We are not handing over a multi-million-dollar vehicle because someone standing near a fence made a few observations. Nobody said hand it over, the younger engineer replied. Let him look. Victoria studied both men. Then she looked at Jack. He appeared completely unconcerned by the discussion. Sophie sat on a nearby bench swinging her legs gently while watching everything unfold. To her, this seemed less like a corporate crisis and more like one of the science puzzles she enjoyed solving at school. Dad, she called. Yes? Is this the part where everybody argues before they try the obvious thing? Several people heard her. A few looked away to hide their reactions. Victoria surprised herself by smiling. It was the first genuine smile she had managed all afternoon. Finally she made a decision. 5 minutes, she said. The crowd immediately became still. The senior engineer looked shocked. Victoria, she raised a hand. 5 minutes. Then she turned toward Jack. You said that was all you would need. Jack glanced toward Sophie. Apparently I did. Sophie grinned proudly. Jack walked toward the vehicle. No dramatic entrance. No sudden confidence. No speech. He simply moved through the crowd like a man approaching a normal workday. Several engineers stepped aside reluctantly. Others watched with open skepticism. Jack stopped beside the rear compartment and studied the area he had been observing for hours. He did not immediately touch anything. Instead, he looked. Then he looked again. 30 seconds passed. Then another 30. The senior engineer folded his arms. Interesting strategy. Jack ignored the comment. His eyes moved across a series of components. Then toward a connection point. Then toward a small area near the source of the earliest system irregularity discovered in the logs. Finally, he nodded once. There it is. Nobody spoke. The younger engineer stepped forward. What? Jack pointed. Did anyone inspect this physically? The senior engineer frowned. Of course. Jack remained calm. Inspect it or verify it? The question sounded familiar now. Several engineers exchanged glances. Jack carefully examined the area again. Then he reached toward a small connection assembly that appeared normal at first glance. This component is reporting correctly, he said. That is the problem. The younger engineer stared at him. What does that mean? It means everyone trusted the report more than the source. The crowd remained silent. Jack made a small adjustment. Nothing dramatic. No special tool. No complicated procedure. Then he stepped back. Try it. The senior engineer looked irritated. That is it? Jack nodded. That is it. Victoria looked toward the vehicle. Then toward the engineers. Then back toward Jack. Around her, 20 experts stared at the machine they had spent the entire day trying to understand. Nobody moved for several seconds. Because suddenly, after hours of certainty, nobody was completely sure what would happen next. For a moment, nobody moved. The entire plaza seemed suspended between expectation and disbelief. The senior engineer looked at the vehicle, then at Jack, then back at the vehicle again. Go ahead, Victoria said quietly. One of the engineers finally stepped forward and entered the driver's seat. Dozens of people watched. Reporters lowered their phones. Conversations disappeared. Even Sophie stopped swinging her legs and focused on the car. The engineer pressed the ignition sequence. A second passed. Then another. Suddenly the vehicle responded exactly as it should have from the beginning. System indicators stabilized. Diagnostic warnings disappeared. The engine came to life with smooth precision. The sound echoed across the plaza. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke. The silence was far more powerful than applause. 20 engineers stared at the machine they had spent the entire day trying to repair. The younger engineer looked genuinely amazed. The senior engineer remained frozen. Victoria slowly exhaled. She had not realized she had been holding her breath. Nearby, Sophie smiled. I knew it. Jack glanced at her. You did? Not exactly. She shrugged. But you always make that face when you already found the answer. Several people nearby laughed softly. The tension that had dominated the afternoon began to dissolve. Meanwhile, the engineers gathered around the area Jack had examined. They studied the component carefully. They reviewed the logs again. This time the evidence was obvious. Once the incorrect assumption had been removed, the entire sequence made sense. The younger engineer shook his head. We were looking at the result instead of the cause. Jack nodded. It happens. To 20 engineers, the younger man asked. Especially to 20 engineers. The answer carried no arrogance. No criticism. Just experience. Victoria walked toward him. For the first time all day, she looked less like a CEO managing a crisis and more like someone trying to understand a puzzle. How did you see it? She asked. Jack looked toward the vehicle. I did not see more. Victoria waited. Then what? I assumed less. The simplicity of the answer seemed to surprise her. Around them, the crowd slowly began returning to normal. Investors resumed conversations. Reporters started discussing new angles for their stories. Engineers continued reviewing data. Yet Victoria remained focused on one question. Who are you? Jack smiled faintly. Just a mechanic. Several engineers exchanged skeptical looks. Nobody believed that answer anymore. Sophie stood and walked over carrying her museum gift bag. Dad, we are definitely late now. Jack checked the time and laughed quietly. You are right. Victoria watched as he prepared to leave. No business card. No request for recognition. No attempt to impress anyone. He seemed completely satisfied to walk away after solving a problem that had consumed an entire team of specialists. As Jack and Sophie started toward the parking garage, the younger engineer approached Victoria holding a tablet. His expression had changed again. This time it contained something closer to shock. "Victoria," he said. "I think you should see this." She looked down at the screen. It displayed a professional profile connected to a series of elite performance engineering projects. The name at the top made her stop walking. Jack Carter. And the list of accomplishments beneath it explained why he had never needed to tell anyone who he was. Victoria remained standing beside the plaza entrance long after Jack and Sophie disappeared toward the parking garage. Around her, the event had finally returned to normal. The vehicle was operational. The investors were satisfied. The reporters had found a new story to tell. Yet none of those things held her attention. She was still looking at the profile displayed on the tablet. Years of elite performance engineering projects. Consulting work for manufacturers whose names were recognized around the world. Technical contributions referenced by experts she respected. Awards. Certifications. Recommendations. The deeper she looked, the more one fact stood out. Almost none of it had been publicized. The younger engineer shook his head. "I cannot believe he never mentioned any of this." Victoria closed the tablet. The people who need to mention their accomplishments usually do not have many. The word surprised even her. Less than an hour earlier, she would not have said something like that. Across town, Jack and Sophie sat together in a small diner near the river. A plate of pancakes rested in front of Sophie while Jack drank coffee across from her. The noise of the expo already felt far away. "So," Sophie said between bites, "did you fix the car?" Jack smiled. Apparently. Apparently? That is what they tell me." Sophie laughed. 20 engineers could not figure it out. 20 engineers were trying to solve a difficult problem. And you solved it. Jack stirred his coffee. Eventually. Sophie pointed at him with her fork. "You are doing that thing again." "What thing?" "The thing where you pretend something was not impressive." Jack looked out the window toward the evening traffic. Most problems are not impressed by the person solving them. Sophie rolled her eyes dramatically. "That sounds like a dad answer." "That is because I am a dad." They both laughed. Back at the convention center, Victoria reviewed the final details of Jack's background one last time. Then she noticed something buried near the bottom of the profile. Several years earlier, after the death of Sophie's mother, he had gradually stepped away from prestigious projects and high-profile consulting work. He had chosen flexibility over recognition. Time with his daughter over status. The realization stayed with her. For the first time, she understood that the most important decision in his life had nothing to do with engineering. It had been fatherhood. As the sun began to set over Chicago, Victoria stepped outside and looked across the skyline. She thought about the crowd, the experts, the assumptions, and the man who never felt the need to prove anything. Meanwhile, Jack and Sophie left the diner and started walking toward their truck. Sophie slipped her hand into his. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Why did everybody keep asking who you were?" Jack opened the passenger door for her and smiled. "Because sometimes people think a title tells them everything they need to know." Sophie climbed inside. "And it does not?" Jack shook his head. Before closing the door, he gave the answer that would stay with her for years. The smartest people usually spend more time listening than proving they are smart. Sophie smiled. "I like that." Jack nodded. Then they drove away into the evening traffic while the city lights slowly came alive around them. Neither of them looked back.